right. We are live. Monday morning. The bummer. SAISD has 4-day week. This week and next week. They had Friday and Monday off. We don't. We're here. Unfortunately. But just look at it this way. We are approaching the halfway point. Right? Next week's 8 weeks. It gives us 8 weeks left. So a couple things. We have lab. We're outside. We're going to meet down in the lab. We have a quiz to take down in the lab. And then you'll get a brief introduction to what we're doing. And then we will meet out at the Red Arroyo. All right. It's not a very difficult place to find. Kind of give you an idea. And we'll have some maps out there too. Our building's right here. This is Johnson, runs through campus. All right, there's the pathway. That's where the walkway light is. So we're right here. We are going down to here. If we did train maps, here's your football fields. Our building's right here. From there, Cabinet Science Building, and we are going right down to here. You can see it's 4 minutes. If we have to, we can walk. It would be a nice 15-minute walk. But we're going to head down there. We'll meet there, and then we'll get started. We'll collect for about an hour. When you're there, I know in my class, and I believe Dr. Skipper's the same way. Once we're done, I'll collect all the nets. I'll collect the data sheets, any of the clipboards that get taken out, and then you're free to leave at that time, and I'll transport everything back. All right. Look something up. Also, saw this. I don't know if you saw it or not. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. But check that out. A lit match. Look at the shadow. Now you can come up with the physics of it, but in light of it being October, I would say that the flame is actually a vampire. It just doesn't cast a shadow. I think interesting. It's October. Come on, get in the spirit. Get in the spirit. No, I won't dress up, but that doesn't mean everyone else will. All right, so this is where we left off. Don't forget we had a quiz. Quiz is due tomorrow night, I believe, right? That's the terrestrial variation, the ecological filtering stuff. We're talking about terrestrial systems. We'll see if we get through, or we're talking about the aquatic systems now. We'll see if we get through it. My guess is we won't. We'll finish this up on Wednesday. All right, so what we left off with the aquatic systems is separating it between a lentic system and a lotic system. So the lentic system are those ponds and lakes, basically those that don't have a flowing water. It's not consistent. We're not talking about currents. Yeah, so when dealing with like an ocean, you probably consider that more of a lentic system. Oceans have current. Even big lakes have some currents as well. What we're talking about is lentic systems. They don't have the continuous flowing water all in one direction. All right, that's what lotic systems are, all of our rivers and streams. With our aquatic systems, we recognize that they are associated with terrestrial systems. So there is that interaction between the two. You're going to have nutrient flow. Now, our sources of aquatic energy could be derived from entirely inside our system. Those are our autochthonous sources, or you can get them from outside of the system, so from the terrestrial system that then washes in. These are the allochthonous sources. And our aquatic systems differ in the amounts of these two different types of organic sources. So if we're going to be entirely autochthonous, then most of our energy is derived through photosynthetic organisms. They capture the sunlight. They're going to convert that solar energy into sugar. Those organic compounds then remain in the system. Allochthonous is going to have less photosynthetic organisms, or less primary production, because you have most of your carbon sources coming into it, which changes what type of community we're going to have. It's most prominent in our river systems, in the Lotic systems. All right, so in these river-type systems, the rate of flow and the pattern of water flow is probably the most important physical characteristic. These two things, rate and the pattern of flow, seem to drive the communities that we see in those systems. Now, the flow is going to be determined by the gradient or the angle of the underlying topography. All right, so it should just kind of make sense. The steeper the elevation change, the faster the water is going to flow, right? And you can do this, experimentally with the table. Pour a little bit of water on this table. It's going to sit there mostly, right? And then if you take one end of the table and lift it up, you're going to make it roll right off, flow right off. That makes sense. The other aspect of this flow is the depth of the river itself, the depth of the stream. All right, so if you have a long, wide stream, very, very wide, flow is probably going to be slow. If you start to narrow that stream, you are now confining the space in which that water is going to fit. All right, and the water's not going to expand, it's just going to flow faster through it. So if you have like the same depth or the same approximate basin, all right, going from a wide, slow moving, and make it more narrow, you're going to make a fast moving water flow. Same applies if we keep the amount of water the same and the width of the river the same. If you have a shallow versus a deep area, deeper rivers tend to flow a little bit slower. All right, but again, there's a lot of things at work that determine the rate of flow and the pattern of our water flow itself. So we didn't even talk about the underwater boulders, the edges of the stream system that could produce very slow-moving areas that allow some of our phytoplankton to live and survive. Now, in our aquatic systems, the branches of the rivers, you can say the tributaries, are assigned a rank or a number based on their position. So the first order streams are those streams that don't have any tributary. They are typically where the mouth of the river is. Oftentimes there's going to be a spring that feeds into this area. All right, so first order stream has no tributaries. Once you get to a second order stream, the tributaries that are attached to it, so it can have a huge number of tributaries, but all of those tributaries that attach to it are first order streams. All right, and then the third order can also have tributaries, but now that third order stream's only going to have these second order streams attached to it and so forth. So we can kind of keep going up with our streams, keep going up in the order until you get to a river system, which is defined as a stream of at least sixth order. That means then that all of the tributaries going into that river have to be at least fifth order. So you have to have at least streams that has a bunch of tributaries that themselves have a bunch of tributaries that have tributaries and so forth to get all the way up to fifth order. Get this, and then we'll talk about the characteristics of these the characteristics as we increase in our order, stream order. The characteristics of the community and the abiotic factors. Ready? Get it? All right. So as we increase in order, we proceed along a continuum. Right? There's a term for it, river continuum, which is the ecological and hydrological changes, such as energy sources, gradient, and flow, that occur along the course of a stream. They occur along the course of our Lotic system. So what happens at a first order stream is going to be different than at a sixth order river. We're going to have different ecological and hydrological properties. And those changes are going to dictate why you don't see the same types of communities in a river system, sixth order river system, than first order stream. All right, so what are some of these? Well, first, let's talk about the sources of energy. All right, so with our sources of energy at the headwaters in those first order streams, most of the organic energy is going to be provided by allochthonous sources. So you're going to have the organic energy entering in the system from the terrestrial system itself. So in many ways, that first order stream is dependent on the terrestrial system. The primary organic energy is called coarse particulate organic matter. That's our technical term for it. These are the leaves that enter our system. All right, so you can think about the headwaters. You are located typically in a wooded environment. Even here out in Texas, go to head of the river ranch. That's Anson Springs, starting point of our South Concho River. You know, those of you that have had a class with Dr. Strength, maybe he takes you down to Big Oak River Ranch. Right, there's a stream right on that property, a spring-fed stream. All right, all of the leaves that enter, that's coarse particulate organic matter. That's going to serve as our food source for our macroinvertebrates who are going to be shredding it, consuming it, and transforming it into these finer particulate organic matter. So FPON. So the coarse particular organic matter, you're going to have specialized organisms that break this down and consume it. And by breaking them down, we now produce fine particulate organic matter that's going to start to flow downstream because we are in a Lotic system. All right. So then, as we move downstream, most of the energy that we're going to provide to that system is in the form of this fine particulate organic matter that came from these lower order streams. But we now also introduce the production of algae. It's not saying we don't have algae growing in those first tributaries. It's just the vast majority of the energy is the coarse particulate organic matter. Once we start getting down to the higher order rivers, now we're talking about wider areas, more sunlight getting down to the surface. All right, and if you have more sunlight down to the surface of the stream and the bottom of the stream, now you're promoting algal growth. And the algae can now contribute to the organic energy. All right, so the headwaters is all about organic material that enters in the stream from the terrestrial system. You have your shredders, decomposers breaking down those leaves into fine particular organic matter that then travels downstream and is used by some of our filter feeders. And we've got those as well. I believe it's next slide. That's actually what this is starting to say. We've got our shredders, our collectors. These are all specialized on our coarse particulates. You've got your collectors and your grazers. So the collectors are filter feedings. All right, but now you have a much lower proportion of our shredders. because most of the systems now find particulates, and then as you get really downstream, you've got a lot of phytoplankton, a lot of fine particulates. Now it's a community mostly dominated by our collectors. So, yeah, so we had a question. So in higher order rivers, does the fine particulate matter count as allochthonous because it was originally terrestrial? Yes, it does. Still a allochthonous system. These rivers are primarily driven by allochthonous energy. But we do have some contribution from autochthonous once we start getting our photosynthetic organisms. But still mostly fine particulates. All right. Now, with the organic energy and what's entering in the pond, that does play a role in the shredder versus collectors, collectors versus grazers, and then just dominant of collectors. And note, you have predators in all of them. Predators are going to feed on whatever's there, right? And you can have specialized predators based on the organisms that are there, right? But the specific types of shredders, the specific types of collectors are going to be determined by their law of tolerance curves. All right, so they have to be able to survive the physical conditions that are there. Now, what types of physical conditions are there? Well, in an aquatic system, we have to take into account the oxygen concentration, the temperature, and the nutrient content. All right? So the two big ones for us is oxygen concentration and temperature. So in oxygen concentration, the amount of oxygen in the water is going to be dependent on the temperature of the aquatic system and how much disturbance there is, because oxygen has to dissolve into the water. The more surface agitation you have, all right, that increases your surface area and thus increase diffusion rates or increase the amount of oxygen that can diffuse into the system. So at our lower order streams up near the headwaters, you see a higher content of oxygen. Part of that is because of the increased surface area and agitation. So if you consider this table as being a smooth water surface, we've got a surface area like just right here. As I start lifting it and agitating it, you're causing these waves and ripples. Those waves and ripples are going to cause this surface to have a much larger surface area. All right, so it's not necessarily the water running over the rocks and churning. I mean, that plays some role. It's really about increasing the surface area. Increasing the surface area. The other part of that is when we are at when we're at one of these lower order streams, when we're near the headwaters, we tend to be at elevation, or here, we're dealing with spring-fed systems where that water coming up out of the ground is cold or cool. Cooler water holds more oxygen. Right? So if you increase temperature of water, you decrease the oxygen saturation point. You decrease the temperature, you increase the oxygen saturation point. So at our areas up here, we're dealing with organisms that need a high oxygen concentration. If we take organisms that live up here and transplant them down to one of these higher order systems, a lot of times they can't survive. Not necessarily the temperature, there's just not enough oxygen for them to live. All right, so temperature is the other aspect. We talked about temperature and the oxygen relationship. All right, but we also have temperature as an abiotic factor. Our organism has to be in its zone of tolerance for it to survive. And that's why you typically see trout in these at the higher or the lower order rivers than at our higher order. You don't see trout that usually need high oxygen concentrations. You don't see them near the mouth of the river. You see them at the headwaters. Nutrient content also changes. Nutrient overall tends to be lower in these lower order streams. You get less photosynthesis that occurs. All right, you're dependent on all of those allochthonous sources. You're dependent on all of the leaves coming in, and then the leaves have to be broken down. So the rate of breaking them down into other food sources can dictate how much available energy is present. And then as they break them down, they continuously break them down. Or you have these shredders that are breaking them down until basically everything that's down in our high order system is fine particulate matters. So part of this nutrient content, how much of those leaves go into the aquatic system, is based on the watershed area and the runoff that happens. All right, so if you have a very narrow valley, all right, where that headwater is, you probably have a very low watershed region, which means there's less water that's going to flow into that system when it rains. Compare that to a much wider area, all right, broader valley, where when it rains, it deposits a lot of nutrients into that system. And same thing with the soils itself. All right, so usually in those areas, you have rocky soils, tend to be younger or thin soils. So if there's soil at all, it's could filled with organic nutrients, but the plants are going to take it. So the plants tend to derive those soils, and of course the rocks, you're just relying on weathering and erosion of the rocks to get any nutrients in there. So the end result is that up at these headwaters, low nutrients. As we drift down to our bigger rivers, we've got higher nutrient situations. All right, so we've built in the macroinvertebrate communities as we're talking about these changes, because that's what we have on our figure. We've kind of broken down the proportions. So our communities generally consist of 4 types of macroinverts. They've got your shredders, your collectors, your grazers, and your predators. I guess a predator, but yeah, we've got some invertebrate predators. Our shredders feed on the coarse particulates. They break them down into the fine particulates. Mayfly larvae, great example of it. All right. At BioBlitz, where the mayflies out, the mayflies emerging. Yep. They're out there. They're shredders. The collectors are going to pick up and filter the fine particulates and then other small organic particles. So collectors utilize morphological traps. A classic example would be a caddisfly larva. They can produce like what looks like silk web that captures these fine particulates. Once they get captured, then they move them into their mouth so they can feed. All right. Our grazers feed on the periphyte. So the algae that's attached to the objects in the streams. So those would be our snails. And then our predators, which occur at all stages, they're going to feed on other organisms. But the predators that you see depends on what our dominant community is. Is it mostly made up of shredders? Is it mostly made up of collectors? Is it mostly made up of grazers? All right, so as we travel down, you've got primarily shredders, middle streams, primarily collectors, and you start getting your grazers because now you're starting to have a photosynthesis take place. Light is actually now getting down there to the stream, and then at the higher order streams, it's mostly the collectors, mostly filter feeding. And you can see it. Tend to be dark and muddy, silty, you can say. Oops. All right. Fish communities also change, and we said that it's dependent on our temperature, oxygen, as well as the dominant prey species. You're not going to put a fish, a channel catfish, up at a first order stream because you don't have its food source. It's not there. All right. Give you some time to finish this up, and then we'll at our transition to the Lentic system, I'll give you the quiz answer. Attendance quiz. All right. Attendance quiz answer. Question was asking what is the correct shade of blue? 5 shades. The correct answer is sky blue. Sky blue. I guess in light of this, I should have done like aqua. But no, it's sky blue today. Sky blue. All right, did you get them? Sky blue? All right. Take the attendance quiz. That's a Lotic system, river system. Lentic systems are quite a bit different. They're quite a bit different because we don't have the flowing water. And that's number one. If we don't have the flowing water, then the characteristics of our system, the key characteristics, will be different. It's no longer how much energy do we have entering the system. You know, what's the temperature and how much agitation we have. That is less of a concern. So in our lentic systems, in our ponds and lakes, the physical characteristics of that lake or pond is going to be determined by the size and the depth. How big is it? What's its depth? All right, and then we can kind of go, we can talk about basin morphology, because it's not just the overall size and the depth, but it's also like the slope. How quickly does it get deep? How quickly does it get deep? So the most important characteristic of our deep lakes is the temperature gradient that develops inside of it. All right. The gradient that we have is going to affect the distribution and the abundance of oxygen and other nutrients. All right, so what is this temperature gradient? Well, or why does it even form? So it forms because of solar energy. Sunlight's going to hit the surface of that pond, that lake. It's going to warm the surface. All right, but the sunlight, as we've learned, will get absorbed and scattered before it reaches the depth. So our warming is going to occur at our surface. So this surface is going to warm. In order to get that warmth down to the depths is for the water to move. All right? But it doesn't necessarily do that, because what ends up happening is as it's warming, you get a change in density of the water. And once you get a change in density of the water, we can produce something called stratification, which is a layering of our water in the lake. And that layering is due to the temperature differences, aka the density. And once we get that layer, we're going to start limiting the amount of circulation that takes place. So, I have a feeling someone dropped a big piece of chalk that I pulled out. Let's pull this out. Let's diagram. Go. All right, here's depth. Typically, temperature is up on. The temperatures are x-axis. Make sure you get this. Temperatures are x-axis. Usually on these graphs, that x-axis is going to be at the top because it emphasizes that we're going down through our aquatic system. All right, so if we look at our temperature, what we typically see is something that looks like this. High temperature, high temperature, high temperature, very rapid change, and then low temperature, all the way down to the bottom. All right. This zone is our transition zone. All right, and that has a name. That's called the thermocline. The thermocline. So we have the solar energy coming in, heats up this water, and that forms a density gradient, or a density difference. It increases, or it actually decreases the density, makes it lighter, in essence. All right? And then you have this rapid transition where you've got cold water down here. So you've got this area up here that's circulating and distributing oxygen and nutrients in that area. That layer is called the epilimnion. And this is on our next slide, so we'll get it up. And then below that thermocline is the hypolimnion. And then what we can do is here's our substrate right at the bottom. So you can see that the temperature typically stays pretty low all the way down to our substrate. All right. So our stratification develops and is usually most stable during the summer months. This is when you have the highest amount of solar radiation. It's going to help to maintain the warmth of that surface water in that epilimnion and ensure that that epilimnion stays separate from our hypolimnion. You can typically feel this in a deep lake. Jump into a lake, you'll feel that cold water down by your feet. How deep it is, or how deep is that thermocline, just kind of depends on the time of year and the depth of the lake. So when it first develops, our thermocline is going to actually be fairly shallow. And then the more heating that you have, that thermocline is going to start shifting deeper. All right, it'll start shifting deeper. So sometimes you'll feel it, and it's maybe 3-4 feet down, where maybe your knees and stuff and your thighs feel the cold, that transition zone. Other times, it's maybe 6, 7, 8 feet deep, and you only feel it if you try to go under the water and go deeper. All right. So here's our 3 distinct layers in that stratified lake. That's what I drew up on our temperature diagram. All right, so the epilimnion is that upper, well-mixed and warmer waters of a lake above our thermocline. This area is going to be oxygen-rich because we have the surface agitation and photosynthesis that occurs. So during photosynthesis, remember, plants take CO2, release oxygen. And you do see it right near the surface at the height of the day. You typically see supersaturation, more than what is usual. Thermocline, that's our layer of the lake where the temperature and density of the lake change rapidly. You feel it. This transition prevents circulation between the epilimnion and hypolimnion. They tend to be isolated and separate from each other when stratification occurs. The hypolimnion is the lower, denser, colder water in a lake below our thermocline. That lower, denser, colder water below our thermocline. We're usually oxygen poor. So it would be O2 rich. That's our O2 poor. And the reason why, one is we have limited circulation, so we can't bring oxygen back down to the lake. So once the stratification sets up, whatever oxygen is there is usually going to be the oxygen that remains. All right, unless we have some photosynthesis that occurs, if our light can penetrate down to these depths. All right, and then what ends up happening is that everything that was alive and swimming, when they die, they drop down to the bottom. Now you have aerobic decomposition. So you have your decomposers down there, your bacterial decomposers that are sucking up the O2 all the way to the point where sometimes down right near the substrate, within a couple feet of the substrate, that's basically anoxic. No oxygen present. Still have bacteria that can survive it, all right, but there's no more oxygen down there. Depending on how much of this decomposition occurs, or you can say how little photosynthesis occurs in these areas, you could get hypoxic or anoxic conditions developing throughout the hypolimnion. All right, hypoxic or hypoxic would be like less than what is required. Low oxygen conditions. Anoxic would be no oxygen conditions. All right, and the reason this is because the thermocline prevented that circulation. So not only do we develop a very oxygen poor layer down here, but any nutrients that fell down into the zone get locked away. They can't diffuse back up to the epilimnion because of the temperature, because of the density differences between these two layers. Right. If they fall all the way down to the substrate, there's a good chance it's going to stay there and not come out. So some of that mud and muck, very nutrient rich conditions. Questions? So if we had, did you guys get this? So if we had all of the nutrients locked away down here, then you can develop a system where it's basically alive and thriving in the epilimnion and then basically dead down here. Other than the bacteria, but you know, who really cares about bacteria? Don't tell Dr. Crable I said that. No, you get this situation where you basically create two different environments. But we know that that doesn't always happen because you've got spring and fall. Spring and fall is a change in our seasons where you see differences, changes in our solar radiation. So in the spring, you get the heating up of our top layer. In the fall, you're going to have cooling down of the top layer. And the heating and the cooling. So the heating is what drives the formation of the stratification. The cooling will help to promote the breakdown of this stratification. So in the fall, we can see something that's called turnover. So we called it, the term is fall turnover. That is when we have mixing of our hypolimnion and epilimnion. All right, so now what we're going to do is destroy the thermocline and allows the entire lake to mix. So you're mixing oxygen back down to the hypolimnion, you're pulling nutrients back up to the epilimnion, and so forth. Now, what causes this? Two main things. One, it's the cooling of the surface water. So as the surface water cools, it increases its density. So now we're allowing it to kind of reach closer to the density of our hypolimnion. But that's not the only thing. That's not sufficient to cause the fall turnover. We also have to have wind that generates our surface agitation. But not only that, we need wind to come along our surface, and we've got it here, to cause this circulation to occur. So in autumn, you've got the wind that happens, you're pushing water up onto one side, which means you're removing water here, and because now our density differences aren't very large, it's going to allow some of that hypolimnion to come up to the surface, get to the epilimnion. Same thing, we're building up water on this side. Because the density differences are no longer great, some of that epilimnion is going to be pushing back down into the hypolimnion, so you get this circulation. Now we have this as clockwise. It all depends on which way the wind is blowing. So on real windy days in the fall, we can start to promote this situation where we get complete turnover of our lake or pond. All right, so in the autumn, it's a cooling of the surface water and the wind help promotes this turnover. The spring turnover, as you can guess, occurs in the spring. All right, this also has mixing of the hypolimnion and epilimnion. All right, it's caused by the warming of the water, warming of the surface water, and as well as wind, so you kind of have same type of thing here. All right, but you have to understand that when we get to the winter, and this is a typical like a northern body lake, all right, you're going to have ice that forms. All right, you're going to have ice that forms up there. Ice is going to be colder than 4 degrees, right? 4 degrees is basically the rest of the pond. It's the highest density of water occurs at 4 degrees Celsius. So down below here, you don't really have much mixing at all. But as you start thawing the ice, what you are doing is producing lighter water because it's just now thawed. And then as it starts to warm up, we get an equalization of density, and coupled that with the wind, we can now cause turnover. Now, how important is a spring turnover? Well, you can be debated because in those ponds that just freeze over and then don't have a layer of snow over top, you can still have photosynthesis that occurs right underneath that layer of ice. You have some photosynthesis that occurs in the air bubbles of ice. All right, so as that water thaws, as it warms up to 4 degrees, it's going to fall and you're going to get some mixing. What is the role of mixing? We've already said. Its role is to get oxygen and nutrients circulated throughout the lake. We've got oxygen rich up top, oxygen poor down here. That mixes during fall turnover. That re-energizes the hypolimnium, provides more oxygen for our decomposers to break it down. All right, our nutrients down here. Decomposers produce a lot of nutrients. We're getting them back circulated up to the surface so that when the conditions improve, when it warms, when photosynthesis really starts to kick up, it can really have a lot of primary production. All right. This happens in lakes, deep lakes that have a thermocline. I've never swam in Lake Nasworthy, but my guess is based on the depth, you don't feel it. It's too shallow. And we're at the area where we're at and closer to the equator. You're typically in shallow area lakes that don't ever form this type of stratification. But if you go up to deeper lakes, you'll feel it. You'll see it. All right, so in order for this to occur, this turnover to occur, we have to have stratification. Have to have stratification. If we don't, then it's just constant turnover, just constant mixing. All right, let's call it here. We'll talk about the different zones in our Lentic systems. Let's see here. Yeah, freshwater, and then we'll do our marine environment. So it's possible that we'll probably finish this up on Wednesday, which means our next quiz would go live on Wednesday and it would probably be due on Friday. All right. Have a good one.